It looked like a regular board game: cardboard pieces, colored dice, and rules about railroads and radio towers. But hidden inside the game box was something else entirely: military secrets meant for Moscow. In the early 1980s, James Whitmore was known as a quirky father with a love for board games. His handmade sets became neighborhood favorites: elaborate, educational, and endlessly creative. But what no one realized was that these games weren't just for play. They were weaponized, each one carrying encrypted intel from one of America's most secure defense facilities directly into Soviet hands. The question is, how long had this been going on? And how did the FBI finally catch a spy hiding behind monopoly money and Morse code? On a rainy Thursday afternoon in March 1983, the fifth-grade classroom at Oak Ridge Elementary was filled with the scent of wet coats and the muted rustle of restless children waiting for dismissal, when 11-year-old Peter Whitmore proudly pulled a battered cardboard box from his backpack and set it on the front table for show and tell, declaring it was a board game his dad had made just for the family. "One of a kind," he added with a proud smile. The box, wrapped in fading electrical tape and hand-labeled signal station, drew half-hearted interest from his classmates. But one person in the room froze: Marjorie Levin, the 54-year-old teacher whose gray cardigan and gentle demeanor concealed a past as an Army cryptologic technician. She smiled as Peter explained the rules about moving colored tokens across a map filled with radio towers and rail tracks. But her smile didn't reach her eyes when she noticed that the player pieces had Morse code etched faintly along their bases, and that the scoring track included a strange sequence of repeating primes. After class, when she asked Peter if she could borrow the game for the weekend, he agreed, saying his dad liked feedback. And by dusk, she was home at her kitchen table, examining each component beneath her desk lamp with a magnifying glass, heart thudding with a sense of familiarity she hadn't felt in a decade. It was subtle. The game board's map was a fictionalized version of Northern Virginia, but some of the tower positions correlated eerily with known radio interception sites she had encountered during her Army service. The rulebook contained what looked like random transmission codes, but with each symbol analyzed under her old training protocols, she realized the shapes were layered substitutions, a modified Visionaire cipher paired with a codebook structure hidden in the station manual. Within hours, Levin had decrypted enough of the cards to reveal short bursts of operational language, phrases like frequency sweep beta and uplink confirms by 0400, and the realization hit her like a gut punch. This was no game. This was a disguised transmission system built for compartmentalized code delivery, likely piggybacking on a known children's medium to mask intent and limit suspicion. She rechecked her work, hoping she was wrong, but by 3 a.m., after charting the full pattern across several of the game's mechanics, especially a rotating signal wheel that functioned like a cipher disk, she was certain this was a communication protocol and not a child's fantasy. She sat back, exhausted and shaken, thinking about who Peter's father might be and why a defense contractor. She now suspected this based on the regional references in the code would build a game board that spoke in signals only trained eyes could catch. The implications were staggering. Someone had embedded a covert information pipeline into a toy, and its soul had ended up in her classroom, not through espionage, not through black market channels, but through a child's innocent pride in his father's cleverness. Marjorie Levin reached for the phone and paused. She was going to call the FBI, but first she needed to document everything. To the outside world, James Whitmore was the definition of suburban normalcy. A mid-level engineer with a slight stoop, a tidy lawn, and a predictable routine, working weekdays at a nondescript government-contracted defense facility just outside Arlington, Virginia, and spending his evenings at home with his wife Linda and their 3 children in a modest 2-story colonial where dinner was served promptly at 6 and board games followed at 7. But within the 4 walls of that perfectly average home, James nurtured a private obsession: the design and meticulous construction of handmade board games, each one entirely unique, crafted from cardboard, wood, metal tokens, and a bewildering array of personalized rules that he claimed were inspired by history, science, and strategy. His family thought it charming, even brilliant, that their husband and father poured so much energy into a harmless hobby, often staying up late to hand-paint terrain tiles or carve custom dice. From resin molds in the basement workshop he called Mission Control, a space cluttered with soldering irons, UV pens, antique radios, and stacks of hand-drawn maps that, to anyone without the context, resembled vintage wargaming charts or obsolete topographical studies. Linda helped laminate boards and bind rulebooks, assuming the strange phrases like delta sweep and signal oscillation were just immersive touches for James's increasingly complex creations, and the kids, Peter, Emily, and Todd, were eager test players, gluing on tokens, arranging spinner wheels, and proudly bringing prototypes to school or birthday parties, never realizing they were unwitting couriers for a system of espionage more sophisticated than most Cold War field kits. Inside these games, James embedded strips of microfilm behind removable tiles, used invisible ink to mark critical spaces, and designed cipher wheels that could, when rotated through the right combinations of game turns, decode entire sets of stolen data related to classified surveillance algorithms, stealth signatures, and early satellite positioning systems. What made it all possible was his position at Ellison Krieger Systems, a high-clearance contractor involved in signal intelligence architecture, access that gave him fragments of compartmentalized data he knew how to assemble into something coherent once it left the walls of the secured complex. But James didn't smuggle documents or photograph blueprints in the traditional sense. He memorized specs, copied formulas onto scratch sheets during his lunch breaks, and later transcribed them into obscure puzzle mechanisms layered into the game rules, embedding valuable information in what looked like a complicated move structure involving broadcast sweeps and transmission overrides, phrases his children recited without understanding their meaning. What no one around him understood, not his colleagues, not his wife, not even the casual friends from the local tabletop club, was that these games weren't just creative outlets. They were operational payloads, each one a silent message coded through play, disguised in cardboard and math and color, made doubly effective by the complete innocence of those handling them. And to James, this duality was beautiful, the elegance of espionage fused with the innocence of family life, an intricate deception so absurd in form it bordered on art. And no one, not even the KGB handlers he occasionally contacted through a dead-drop mailbox in Falls Church, knew just how deeply he believed in the genius of what he was building. In the gray sprawl of West Berlin during the winter of 1976, where Cold War tensions hung in the air as heavily as the cigarette smoke curling through the conference halls, James Whitmore stood among a cluster of academics and engineers attending a game theory panel at the International Defense Technology Expo, scribbling notes on behavioral algorithms and probability matrices, never imagining that a brief, polite exchange over coffee would set his life on a course that would merge espionage with recreation. The man who approached him was introduced simply as Mikhail, a soft-spoken, Baltic-accented intellectual with horn-rimmed glasses and a deep knowledge of strategic modeling, who complimented Whitmore's recent paper on asymmetrical conflict simulations and asked if he might join him for a beer to continue the discussion. A request James, flattered and professionally curious, accepted without hesitation. They spent hours talking in a smoky Kreuzberg pub, their conversation weaving from Cold War deterrence theory to the mechanics of bluffing in board games, and something in Mikhail's calm intensity, his ability to reference both Clausewitz and chess openings in the same breath, made James feel respected, challenged, and seen in a way few colleagues ever managed. Over the next 3 days, Mikhail returned again and again, at first just for conversation, but soon with questions that grew more specific, more tactical, probing James's understanding of signal-based deception systems and relay interference algorithms. And by the time the expo ended, Mikhail had slipped a business card into James's coat with a Berlin address and a quiet request. If you ever want to explore ideas that don't have to wait for government approval, we should talk. It wasn't framed as recruitment, not overtly, but when James returned to the US, he couldn't stop thinking about it, about the thrill of being listened to, the potential of his ideas finally being applied, and the quiet promise of mattering in a way he didn't within the faceless corridors of Ellison Krieger. 6 months later, while attending another conference in Brussels, James made contact. And the second meeting was different. Mikhail was no longer a curious theorist, but an operative with direction, laying out a plan where James's access to defense systems design could be channeled discreetly using James's own passion for game making. The brilliance, Mikhail explained, was in using what was already organic, James's game prototypes, as couriers for embedded data, transforming play into payloads and masking classified material within recreational logic, rules, and aesthetics. By the end of that summer, James had delivered his first prototype, a game called Silent Tower, inside which a set of rule tokens included magnetic strips coated with portions of a defense signal optimization chart. The Soviets were stunned by the elegance of it, and Mikhail gave him a code name, Toymaker, a moniker that flattered James and fed his sense of control, and thus began the years-long evolution of James Whitmore from hobbyist and patriot to a covert agent designing tradecraft so subtle it passed through customs, classrooms, and community centers without ever raising suspicion. The Whitmore residence on Franklin Court could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting, a red-shuttered colonial with a flag on the porch, a golden retriever that barked dutifully at passing mail trucks, and weekend barbecues where the smell of sizzling ribs drifted between neatly trimmed hedges and the sound of clinking lemonade glasses echoed off the pavement. Inside, Linda Whitmore baked cookies from scratch, Peter practiced his trumpet for the school band, and James, ever the inventive father, showcased his latest homemade board game creations during family nights that had become something of a neighborhood tradition. Friends from down the block would stop by, kids would gather around the dining room table, and James would explain the rules to yet another of his seemingly endless string of intricately designed strategy games, each one with names like Radio Maze, Covert Cargo, or Signal Station, complete with hand-painted tiles, magnetic compasses, and encrypted orders written on laminated cards that glowed faintly under UV light. No one batted an eye. The Cold War aesthetic was considered part of the charm, and neighbors delighted in the novelty of playing spy-themed games in the safety of their suburban enclave, unaware that each piece of the board might be something far more sinister than playful design. Over time, James began distributing his limited editions to game enthusiast groups across the East Coast, small batches sent to hobbyist clubs in Maryland, New Jersey, and even as far north as Vermont, always under the pretense of being handcrafted collectibles for a growing base of board game fans. He shipped them in brown boxes with handwritten labels, sometimes including a note inviting feedback, other times bundling them with newsletters filled with fake game lore. But inside at least one of those boxes, under the molded plastic label tray of a signal station, Deluxe Edition, hidden beneath the felt padding, meant to hold dice, was a tightly rolled strip of microfilm containing 2 full pages of diagrammatic overlays from a classified signal decryption prototype being tested out of a satellite communications facility in Chantilly, Virginia. The package, bound for a gaming club in New Jersey, passed through a regional postal inspection hub in Delaware, where a routine scan flagged a chemical anomaly, nothing definitive, but enough to warrant a random inspection. The microfilm was discovered by a bored postal supervisor looking for contraband, who mistook it for a novelty item at first, then realized it had no logical reason to be inside a children's game. Within 72 hours, the FBI had taken possession of the film and quietly opened a file labeled Project Signal Board, but they had no idea where the package had originated, as the return address on the box was a fake P.O. box in rural Pennsylvania, and the trail went cold, for the moment. Back in Virginia, the Whitmores hosted another Friday game night, serving pot roast, refilling soda glasses, and laughing over a round of uplink sabotage, while James sat at the head of the table, watching the dice roll with a smile that held more calculation than joy, his entire life perfectly camouflaged beneath the rhythm of dice and the illusion of play. By the time the FBI received Marjorie Levin's report about the strange board game submitted during show and tell, the Bureau's counterintelligence division was already on edge from a recent uptick in compromised satellite data transmissions that analysts couldn't trace to any one actor or breach, until now. Levin's detailed breakdown of the game's cipher mechanics, her annotated diagrams of Morse-coded movement charts, and her analysis of the Visionaire-style key hidden inside the station manual were enough to earn the full attention of Special Agent Michelle Dorset, a seasoned intelligence officer whose specialty was low-signature espionage techniques. Within days, the FBI launched a quiet but intensive surveillance program, codenamed Operation Pawn Storm, beginning with discreet monitoring of the Whitmore residence using unmarked vans and parabolic microphones parked 2 blocks away, later escalating to the installation of fiber optic microphones in the living room ceiling and tiny surveillance cameras embedded in a nearby electrical junction box, all without the Whitmores ever knowing. Audio logs confirm that board game nights were routine, at least once a week, sometimes more, and agents noted that each session corresponded within a 72-hour window to subtle but detectable leaks in secure military satellite data, suggesting a repeating information transfer pattern hidden beneath the family's ordinary suburban rhythms. Every outgoing package from the Whitmore address was tracked, scanned, and in several cases discreetly intercepted and replaced with identical duplicates containing embedded trackers and chemical tracers. Then, after 3 weeks of passive monitoring, the FBI launched a trap. Agent Dorsett ordered the creation of a bait board game. Signal Station, Arctic Theater, a near-exact replica of Whitmore's style, complete with magnetic tokens, UV-activated decals, and a glitch in the rules that could only be solved by someone who understood a specific military encryption standard. Inside the game, the FBI embedded a digital fingerprint, a steganographic watermark only visible through layered signal transformation, and hand-delivered the bait package to the Whitmores' mailbox under the pretense of it being a return from a test group in Maine. 2 nights later, audio from the bugged living room picked up the sound of James Whitmore slicing open the box, humming as he inspected the components and saying softly to himself, "They're starting to play back. Clever." What he didn't know was that the altered components inside the fake game included nanofilm coated with a dustable polymer, a chemical so fine it left behind detectable trails wherever it was handled, including the sleeve of the sweater James wore when he left the house the next morning and drove to a game design co-op in Bethesda. There, under FBI surveillance, he handed off the bait game to a young man with no visible ties to intelligence work. But when that man crossed the DC border, a mobile surveillance team stayed locked on him. What began with a child's board game had now become a full-scale federal sting, and the FBI wasn't going to roll the dice. The Northern Virginia Tabletop Designers Expo was the perfect smokescreen, a low-key event in a community center gymnasium just outside Falls Church, drawing hobbyists, indie developers, and nostalgic dads in cargo shorts with old board games tucked under their arms. And that year, James Whitmore registered as a featured exhibitor, proudly reserving a folding table under the innocuous brand name Wolf's Head Games, a title innocently referencing a medieval term for outlaw but doubling as a call sign once used in a KGB drop-point protocol. Linda accompanied him as always, cheerful and utterly unaware, setting up the booth with paper signs and stacking game boxes labeled Uplink Frenzy and Phantom Rail, while Peter and Emily handed out plastic tokens to curious kids wandering past the booths. But across the gym floor, watching through mirrored sunglasses and sipping flat coffee from a styrofoam cup, Special Agent Michelle Dorsett stood shoulder to shoulder with her partner, Agent Lyle Green, both posing as freelance game designers from Vermont, eager to network and share notes. The moment James launched into his practice demo, a strategy game involving coded train routes and power relay sabotage, the agents listened carefully, noting that beneath the surface-level rules was a highly specific logic structure that mirrored declassified communications, jamming protocols from 1979, a clue so precise it could only have come from someone with defense access. An hour into the expo, a tall man in a camel-colored coat approached the booth and said only, "Glad you're back this year," before accepting a copy of Phantom Rail Deluxe, shaking James's hand and slipping a numbered punch card into the back pocket of the game box in one fluid motion. To a casual observer, it looked like a sale, but to Agent Dorsett, it was the pass they'd been waiting for. The man gave no name, declined the offer to join the mailing list, and disappeared down the side hallway where vendors exited to the parking lot. Within moments, an FBI tail was in motion, a black sedan pulling into traffic, a discreet 3 cars behind the suspect's beige Buick. The vehicle traveled north toward the Beltway and veered off onto I-95, finally stopping 5 hours later in the Bronx at a nondescript brownstone used for diplomatic lodging, its mailbox registered to a cultural attaché from the Soviet consulate in New York. By the time the game box was recovered from a trash can outside the building 2 nights later, the punch card was gone. But what remained inside was more telling. A laminated reference sheet detailing penalty modifiers based on radio tower interference zones that matched exactly to the jamming radius of classified satellite dishes operating out of Groom Lake, Nevada. knowledge far above the level of an ordinary hobbyist. The exchange was brief, almost invisible, but for the FBI, it was confirmation. The man James handed the Yisud. Game to had diplomatic immunity, a known associate of Soviet external services, and they just walked into a handoff mid-operation. Whitmore had no idea yet, but the net around him had just gotten smaller. The pre-dawn raid on 314 Franklin Court was executed with clinical precision. 6 agents in tactical jackets moved up the walkway under a veil of silence, flashlights clipped to vests, sidearms holstered but ready, their breath fogging in the January air as a 7th agent rang the bell and announced the warrant with crisp authority. Linda Whitmore, startled and robe-clad, opened the door with a bleary expression that collapsed into panic as she was gently but firmly moved aside, her eyes darting toward the stairs where James, already awake, stood motionless at the landing, hands gripped tightly on the railing as if calculating how many steps it would take to reach the basement before they stopped him. But he didn't run. Instead, he turned without a word and led the agents down to the workshop, flicking on the overhead fluorescents that buzzed to life above rows of shelves, stacks of game boxes, and a large central table cluttered with scissors, glue guns, UV pens, and a bowls soldering station that still smelled faintly of burnt plastic. What looked at first like an eccentric's crafting lair quickly revealed itself as something far more methodical. One wall, when illuminated by a forensic UV light, glowed with faint stenciled coordinates and diagrammatic overlays of geosynchronous orbits. Several open game boxes contained miniature film canisters hidden beneath false bottoms, each containing rolled negatives that, when processed, would later reveal technical schematics for antenna arrays, telemetry calibration procedures, and uplink path redundancies, all marked with classification stamps only visible through magnification. The agents found dice drilled and resealed, hollow cores housing slivers of magnetic tape encoded with narrowband frequency tests. A Monopoly-style game called Comms and Counters included plastic houses with embedded RFID tags designed to activate at specific frequencies, a crude but effective signaling method that had never been tested in the field but showed terrifying ingenuity. Tucked inside a box labeled Signal Station, Collector's Edition was the real prize. A laminated card designed to look like a player aid, but printed in a font nearly too fine to read. Its columns listing not fictional rules, but actual satellite relay coordinates, signal bounce diagrams, and specifications matching U.S. Department of Defense uplink terminals. Every piece of every game seemed to serve a dual function, one for the player, one for the handler, and the realization hit the agents like a wave. Whitmore had essentially built a modular courier system with embedded tradecraft so intuitive it could be passed through a family game night, through mailrooms and classrooms, across borders and fences, without a single suspicious glance. It wasn't just espionage, it was genius, and it was deeply unsettling in its banality. When Agent Dorsett lifted a stack of player tokens and found a microdot film embedded in the foam, she knew there was no coming back from this. The line had been crossed, and every innocent gesture in this man's life now looked like a maneuver. James Whitmore was handcuffed without incident, the room photographed in exhaustive detail, and as the agents filed out with boxes marked evidence, a neighbor walking his dog stared from across the street, confused, as if trying to understand how something so deeply wrong could have lived for so long behind such an ordinary front door. The interrogation room at the Alexandria field office was deliberately unremarkable. Beige walls, a bolted metal table, 2 chairs, and a camera dome in the corner that hummed softly. And James Whitmore sat alone for nearly 40 minutes before anyone spoke to him, hands cuffed in front, posture straight, eyes fixed on a faint stain in the tabletop, as if concentration alone might hold his world together. When Special Agent Michelle Dorsett finally entered with a legal pad and a paper cup of water, James greeted her with polite detachment, denying everything before a single question was asked, insisting the games were a hobby, the tools were for craftsmanship, the microfilm an elaborate misunderstanding, and the phrases in the rulebooks nothing more than thematic flavor borrowed from his interest in Cold War history. For hours he maintained the facade, calmly explaining away each discovery as coincidence or misinterpretation, even suggesting that the FBI had projected meaning onto harmless creativity. And it was only when Dorsett placed a small, unassuming game piece on the table, a gray plastic relay tower from Signal Station, that his composure finally cracked. She unscrewed the base with a precision screwdriver, slid out a wafer-thin strip of encoded magnetic film, and then, without looking at him, recited aloud the decrypted contents. A compressed data sequence describing satellite uplink timing, windows accurate to within milliseconds. Information so sensitive James's jaw tightened involuntarily as he heard it spoken. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, and when James finally exhaled, it was with the resignation of someone who had been waiting years for the moment his secret would be understood. He didn't cry, didn't shout. Instead, he leaned back and smiled faintly, a smile tinged with pride, and said, "You have to admit, it was elegant," before launching into a confession that was less apology than explanation. He spoke of ideology first, not loyalty to the Soviets, he clarified, but contempt for what he called artificial secrecy, a belief that information wanted to be free, and that governments weaponized knowledge for control rather than protection. Then of ego, of being smarter than the system, of building something no one else had thought of, something that passed through children's hands in suburban mailboxes without detection. He admitted the thrill mattered too, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every dice roll and rule clarifications carried weight far beyond the table, that he had turned the most innocent ritual of American life into a delivery mechanism for forbidden truth. Throughout it all, he insisted his family knew nothing, that Linda believed it was a harmless pastime, that his children were only helpers, never couriers in intent. But the agents listening weren't convinced, noting the repetition of terms his kids used, the ease with scissor, which prototypes circulated, the way his wife had helped assemble components that no casual hobbyist would require. When pressed, James grew defensive, almost angry, insisting that his family was off limits, that the game had always been his alone. But the damage was done. The FBI now had a confession, corroborated by physical evidence, and a portrait of a man who hadn't stumbled into espionage but had gamified it, convinced that intellect and ingenuity placed him above consequence. When the interrogation ended, James was led back to a holding cell, still calm, still convinced that history might one day see him not as a traitor, but as a designer who had beaten the board itself. The courtroom was silent, sterile, and nearly empty, an acoustically muffled space inside the Eastern District of Virginia's sealed federal complex, where no press badge was allowed and no transcript would ever be made public, because the case of United States v. James Whitmore was classified before it began. A rare trial conducted entirely behind closed doors under the provisions of the Classified Information Procedures Act, with jurors selected under gag orders and attorneys bound by silence more absolute than attorney-client privilege. Even the docket listed only a coded designation, Case 82749B, redacted from public view, and nowhere in the official record did the words board game or espionage ever appear in the same sentence. Whitmore was charged with multiple counts under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, including 793B and 794A, the willful transmission of national defense information to a foreign power, and though he sat in court clean-shaven and composed, the evidence against him was insurmountable. Forensic analyses of altered game pieces, microfilm extracted from foam tokens, satellite specs found embedded in punch cards, and a full confession detailing years of systematic tradecraft disguised as children's entertainment. His defense counsel attempted to argue diminished responsibility, citing intellectual obsession and a dissociative belief that he was acting in the interest of global information equity, but the judge, herself a former NSA legal advisor, rejected the argument with a tone of cold finality, stating that ideological rationale was no shield for deliberate betrayal. The trial took only 5 days, and on the 6th, Whitmore was sentenced to 35 years in a federal supermax facility, with no possibility of parole until year 20, and no credit for cooperation since his information, while colorful, had failed to expose a wider network. Outside the courthouse, there were no reporters, no cameras, no headlines, just a 2-line wire release buried in the back of the Washington Post's legal briefs section, noting that an unnamed defendant had been convicted on sealed national security charges. The Whitmore family vanished shortly afterward, the result of a quiet but thorough relocation program, coordinated by the Department of Justice and supported by a CIA domestic containment unit, which helped Linda Whitmore and her 3 children assume new identities in a different state. their records sealed, their homes sold under a shell trust, and their names scrubbed from school rosters and property deeds alike. The neighbors were told the family had moved suddenly for health reasons, and only a few noticed how the house stayed vacant for nearly 6 months, its windows shuttered, its mailbox taped shut. Those who did remember the Whitmores would occasionally ask each other what really happened, their voices dropping low at backyard cookouts, but no one ever knew the deed. Truth, that beneath the surface of their quiet street had lived a man who'd turned game nights into acts of war, who'd built weapons out of dice and cardboard, and whose final play had cost him everything, except perhaps the satisfaction that no one had ever guessed the rules until it was too late. It was nearly 2 decades after the Whitmore case had vanished from sealed court records and the man himself had disappeared into the belly of a federal supermax, when a modest dust-covered box labeled Signal Station, Beta Run, surfaced at a private estate auction in upstate New York, nestled between vintage Lionel trains and Civil War chess sets from a deceased collector's attic. And had it not been for the curiosity of a retired NSA cryptanalyst named Harris Bell, attending out of nostalgia more than interest, it might have been sold as little more than a Cold War-themed oddity. The box was incomplete, its corners frayed, the instruction manual missing, but the moment Bell examined the game's player tokens, identical relay towers with microscopic etchings along their bases, his pulse quickened. Because the symbols weren't decorative, they were phonetic glyphs used in encrypted dead-drop matrices during the 1980s, a format so obscure only a handful of signals officers had ever worked with it. As he unpacked the pieces under a jeweler's lamp later that night, he found the game board's power grid layout eerily familiar, a radial pattern that, when overlaid with declassified satellite maps, corresponded to 3 now-defunct SIGINT stations along the East Coast. More alarming was the spinner mechanism, which housed beneath it a sealed compartment containing a film reel, warped and brittle with age, but still legible when carefully spooled through an archival viewer, revealing scans of technical diagrams that bore watermark traces of a known contractor's schematics from 1981, each tagged with a reference code that no child's game should have ever known. Bell, stunned, alerted a former contact at Langley, and within 72 hours, a quiet team from a lesser-known Federal Archive division seized the game and all its components under a non-disclosure order, filing the entire incident into a restricted intelligence appendix marked Legacy Artifacts, Whitmore Connection Presumed. Internally, the find prompted a brief review of procedural vulnerabilities, how one man's hobby, infused with charm and subtlety, had nearly outlived its containment, its danger only neutralized by obscurity and the passage of time. In official histories of the Cold War, James Whitmore's name remained redacted, his trial unreferenced, and his family untraceable. But within the intelligence community, the resurfaced board game became a whispered cautionary tale taught in internal briefings and spycraft seminars. The story of how a toy almost undid the veil of national security, not through brute betrayal or dramatic leaks, but through the innocence of game mechanics, cleverly retooled for treason. The recovered signal station set was stored not in evidence lockers, but in a classified training archive, where new generations of analysts would be shown how data didn't always come with flashing lights or intercepted phone calls. Sometimes it came with dice, laughter, cardboard tokens, and the illusion of harmless play. And though the world had moved on from the paranoia of that era, the board itself sat there in silence, its pieces inert, its rules unread, and its legacy etched in the knowledge that betrayal can wear the mask of fun and still hollow out a nation's secrets, one game night at a time. If you found this story as chilling as it is fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real Cold War espionage tales that prove the truth is always stranger than fiction. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous weapons come wrapped in innocence.